Welcome to Earthology. If you enjoy long journeys through the quiet corners of time, take a moment to breathe, settle in, and listen. Tonight, we travel north to the edge of the ancient world. Beyond the green lands of Europe lies a coast of stone and shadow, where the sea meets mountains and the wind never sleeps. It is here that the story of the Vikings begins, not as conquerors, but as survivors, dreamers, and explorers. Long before their name came to inspire both fear and fascination, they were people bound to the rhythm of the earth, learning to live in balance with the elements. Their history begins not with a raid, but with a long winter. Centuries before the first Viking ships crossed the sea, Scandinavia was a harsh, fragmented landscape. The people who lived there, ancestors of the Danes, Norwegians, and Swedes, inhabited a land carved by ice and sea. Massive glaciers had once shaped the valleys and fjords, leaving behind narrow strips of farmland, dense forests, and rugged coasts. Winters were long and merciless, and summers, though bright, passed quickly. For most of the year, snow and darkness ruled. The sun might rise only briefly above the horizon, its pale light sliding across mountains before disappearing again. The world seemed still, but beneath that stillness, life persisted. Communities were small, scattered along rivers or the edges of the sea. The land was poor for agriculture-thin soil, short growing seasons, and unpredictable weather. People survived by combining farming with hunting, fishing, and herding. They raised cattle, sheep, and pigs, cultivated hardy grains like barley and rye, and fished the icy waters for cod and herring. Nothing was wasted. Everything was shared. In these conditions, cooperation meant survival, and loyalty to kin was sacred. The long winters demanded endurance, and that endurance forged a people both practical and unyielding. Every harvest was a victory. Every meal a gift wrested from the cold earth. Society in early Scandinavia was organized around families and clans. Leadership rested in the hands of local chieftains, who were not kings in the later sense, but respected heads of powerful households. Authority came not from law or crown, but from trust and reputation. A good chieftain provided protection, settled disputes, and gave generously from his stores during hard times. Power was personal, and wealth was measured not only in land or silver, but in loyalty. The social fabric was built on honor, an invisible currency that governed every aspect of life. To lose honor was worse than death, and to win it was to earn a place in memory. At the center of each community stood the longhouse, a structure of timber and turf with a single open hearth. Inside, families and servants gathered for warmth. The air was thick with smoke and the scent of wood, meat, and wool. By the light of the fire, stories were told, tales of gods, heroes, and the great world tree that bound heaven and earth. These stories preserved more than belief. They preserved identity. They taught courage, loyalty, and humility before the forces of nature. To live in the north was to be constantly reminded of one's smallness before the vastness of the world. The Norse gods reflected that world. Odin, the wise wanderer, sought knowledge even at the cost of pain. Thor, the thunderer, defended humankind from chaos with his hammer. Frey and Freya governed fertility, harvest, and love. Each god embodied an element of survival in a harsh landscape. Thunder was not simply sound. It was Thor's hammer striking the heavens. The ocean was not merely water. It was a living spirit, unpredictable and divine. In this worldview, courage was the highest virtue. To face hardship without fear was to honor both gods and ancestors. To die bravely was to enter Valhalla, the golden hall, where warriors feasted forever in the afterlife. In such beliefs, death was not the end, but a passage into eternity. But the North was not always steady. In the 6th century, a catastrophe struck. Far beyond Scandinavia, volcanic eruptions in Iceland and Asia filled the atmosphere with ash, dimming the sun across the northern hemisphere. The sky darkened, the temperature fell, and for several years crops failed. The ancient sagas speak of a fimbul winter, a great, unending cold that brought hunger and death. Archaeological evidence confirms widespread famine and decline during this period. Entire settlements were abandoned. Populations shrank. The land itself seemed to turn against its people, yet they endured. When the climate slowly recovered in the centuries that followed, so too did life in the north. The experience left its mark, a deep respect for nature's power and a determination to adapt to whatever came next. By the 8th century, a quiet transformation was underway. The climate grew milder, and harvests became more reliable. Villages expanded, and populations began to rise. Trade and craftsmanship flourished. Tools improved, farming techniques advanced, and communities that had once struggled to survive began to prosper. But with growth came pressure. As families grew larger, the limited farmland could no longer support everyone. Inheritance laws divided property equally among sons, leaving each with less than the generation before. Ambitious young men faced a stark choice: accept a smaller life at home, or seek fortune elsewhere. The North had taught them endurance, but it had also taught them restlessness. Scandinavia's geography offered both challenge and opportunity. The mountains divided, but the sea connected. The long coastline, indented with fjords and islands, became a natural highway. Even before the Viking Age, the people of the North were skilled sailors. They used simple rowing boats to fish, trade, and travel between settlements. The sea was their lifeline. It provided food, linked distant communities, and inspired a culture built around movement. To live near the ocean was to learn its language, the shifting tides, the color of the sky, the patterns of the wind. Over generations, that knowledge became instinct. The sea was not an obstacle. It was a teacher. Trade across the Baltic and North Sea brought the Scandinavians into contact with distant cultures. Amber from the Baltic coast was prized in Europe and traded for silver, wine, and fine cloth. Furs, iron, and walrus ivory were exchanged for glass beads and luxury goods from the south. Through these encounters, the people of the North learned about lands far beyond their fjords. They heard tales of rich kingdoms and great cities, of churches filled with gold and markets alive with wealth. The seeds of ambition began to grow. The North was still remote, but the world no longer felt distant. Yet these early Scandinavians were not yet Vikings in the way we imagine them. They were farmers, fishermen, and craftsmen living by the cycles of nature. Their lives were hard, but their communities were stable, and their world, though small, was deeply interconnected through trade, kinship, and belief. What would transform them into explorers and raiders was not greed or savagery, but necessity and opportunity. As populations grew and resources tightened, young men began to look outward. They dreamed of the unknown, of the lands that lay across the horizon where the sun sank each night. Their culture prepared them for this moment. From childhood, boys were taught the values of courage and independence. To hesitate in the face of danger was shameful. To act boldly was divine. The sagas told of ancient heroes who had traveled far and returned with glory. Warriors who died in battle were honored, their names preserved in song and stone. In such a world, to risk one's life was not reckless. It was a way to achieve immortality. Honor was everything, and one of the surest paths to honor was adventure. The Norse were not a disorganized people. Though divided into many small kingdoms, their society had rules and hierarchies. Chieftains held power, but they relied on the support of their followers. Loyalty was rewarded with feasts, gifts, and the promise of shared success. This structure encouraged ambition. Ambitious men could rise through bravery, charisma, or wealth. For those with little land but great courage, the sea offered a new kind of freedom. Across the water lay a world waiting to be discovered or taken. By the mid-8th century, the stage was set. Climate, population, and technology converged to create a moment of awakening. The people of Scandinavia had everything they needed to move beyond their shores: strong communities, deep seafaring knowledge, and a culture that celebrated risk. The sea, which had once divided them from the world, now beckoned as a path to it. The horizon that had long symbolized limitation became a call. The first expeditions were likely small, quiet ventures, farmers and traders exploring new routes, exchanging goods, and testing the winds. No one could have known that these early voyages would mark the beginning of one of history's most extraordinary ages of exploration. The word Viking, derived from Viking air, meaning a seafarer or adventurer, would come to describe not a people, but a way of life. It meant to leave home in search of something greater, to face uncertainty with courage, to be shaped by the sea and return changed by it. This was the dawn before the storm, the silence before the oars struck water. Scandinavia was awakening from centuries of isolation. Its people had survived famine, rebuilt their world, and learned to master both land and sea. Now, with their hearts and ships prepared, they were ready to step into history. Soon, their sails would darken the horizon of foreign shores, and the world would learn their name. But for now, in the stillness before the raids, all that existed was the sound of the sea, the creak of wood, and the whisper of wind against the longhouse walls. By the 8th century, the people of the North had begun to look outward with new eyes. The harshness of their homeland had forged them into survivors, but now survival was not enough. Prosperity had returned, populations had grown, and ambition stirred quietly within the fjords. The sea that once represented distance and danger began to feel like possibility. It was there all along, waiting. Its rhythms had shaped their lives for generations, and now it would shape their destiny. The sea was both a barrier and a bridge. It separated the people of the North from the rest of the world, but it also connected every coastal village to each other. The Norse understood its moods intimately, the way wind shifted before a storm, the way currents changed with the tide, the way certain birds circled when land was near. This knowledge was not learned from books or instruments, but from experience, passed down through centuries of sailing, fishing, and watching the world with patience. The sea taught them humility, endurance, and respect. It punished arrogance, but rewarded understanding. It was both teacher and test. In the centuries before the Viking Age, the people of Scandinavia had already been building boats. Archaeological finds show that as early as the Bronze Age, they were crossing fjords and coastal waters in small wooden vessels. By the early Middle Ages, these designs had evolved into something remarkable. Boat builders perfected a method of construction called clinker or lapstrake, in which wooden planks overlap each other like the scales of a fish. This technique gave their ships a unique flexibility. Instead of breaking against waves, they bent with them, riding the motion of the sea instead of resisting it. The keel, carved from a single piece of oak, formed the backbone of the vessel, while ribs and planks gave it strength and balance. Every joint was caulked with wool or animal hair, soaked in tar to keep water out. It was craftsmanship refined through trial and memory, born of generations who had learned what the ocean demanded. For centuries, these boats were powered only by oars. Crews rowed close to shore, moving between trading settlements or fishing grounds. But everything changed when they added a sail. No one knows exactly when the first sail rose in Scandinavia, but by the late 8th century, its presence transformed northern seafaring forever. A square of woven wool, stretched across a tall mast, captured the wind and turned raw muscle into motion. What had once been a slow, grueling effort of rowing became a dance with the sky. The sail allowed ships to travel farther, faster, and with greater freedom. For the first time, the horizon was no longer a limit, it was an invitation. The making of a sail was a monumental task. Women, who were vital to the economy and culture of Norse life, wove them by hand using wool from hundreds of sheep. The process took months, sometimes years. Each thread had to be spun, dyed, and treated with oils or animal fat to make it waterproof. The completed sail was immense, large enough to power a ship through both wind and storm. It was the product of skill, patience, and community. Without it, the Viking Age could never have begun. A completed longship was a masterpiece of design, elegant, efficient, and alive. The hull was narrow and light, allowing it to travel at great speed, yet it could carry enough men and supplies to survive long voyages. It had a shallow draft, which meant it could sail across open ocean or glide up shallow rivers where other ships could not go. This made it perfect for both exploration and surprise. The prow was often carved into the head of a dragon or serpent, symbols of power and transformation. These carvings were not just decoration, but spiritual protection, meant to scare away evil spirits and remind those aboard of the forces they carried with them. To the Norse, the ship was not a tool. It was a companion. It had a spirit of its own, shaped by the wood, the wind, and the men who built it. To modern eyes, the longship might seem fragile, an open vessel of wood on a vast, unpredictable sea. But these ships were stronger than they looked. They could survive storms that would sink heavier vessels, their flexible frames absorbing the shock of crashing waves. They were light enough to be carried over land when rivers ended or when the crew needed to cross from one body of water to another. And because they could be beached easily, they allowed swift landings and quick departures. This agility would later make the Vikings the most mobile warriors of their time, capable of appearing suddenly and vanishing before resistance could gather. But before the raids, this same agility made them explorers, traders, and travelers unlike any the world had seen. The Norse navigators did not have compasses or maps. Instead, they read the world itself. They watched the flight of birds and the drift of seaweed. They noted how the color of the water changed with depth, how certain clouds formed above distant land, how the direction of waves shifted near islands. They memorized landmarks, the pattern of stars, and the path of the sun. Some accounts suggest they used sunstone's crystals of Iceland's spar to locate the sun's position even when hidden by clouds, a technique modern science has proven possible. But more than tools, they relied on instinct, a deep, almost spiritual awareness of the sea's moods. To navigate was to become part of the ocean's rhythm, to see with more than sight. Life aboard a ship was difficult, but it was also exhilarating. Crews were small, often 20 to 30 men, each sharing in the labor and the risks. They rowed for hours at a time, resting only when the wind allowed the sail to take over. They ate simple meals of dried fish and bread, drank water or ale stored in barrels, and slept beneath the open sky, wrapped in wool cloaks stiff with salt. On calm nights, when the waves softened and the stars emerged, they would beach their ships, light fires on the shore, and repair their gear. The ocean would whisper against the rocks, and they would talk quietly of home, of family, of the unknown worlds that might lie ahead. These were not men consumed by conquest, but by curiosity and endurance. Theirs was a hard life, but it was also a life of motion, freedom, and wonder. As their ships improved, so did their courage. The early voyages were cautious trading journeys along the coasts of the Baltic and the North Sea. They carried amber, furs, and iron south, and returned with silver, silk, and glass. But every successful trip bred confidence. They began to learn the shape of the wider world, the rivers of Russia, the markets of Frisia, the distant cities of the Frankish Empire. They learned that wealth could be found not only in trade, but in opportunity, and sometimes in the weakness of others. The boundaries between exploration, commerce, and conflict were thin. When hunger or ambition called, trade could easily turn to raid. The word Vikinger, from which Viking comes, did not refer to an ethnicity or a nation. It described an action, To go a Viking was to set out on a seaborne expedition in search of fortune, whether through trade, plunder, or adventure. It was a seasonal pursuit, a way for restless men to seek wealth and glory beyond the limitations of home. Some would return to their farms after summer expeditions, while others made the sea their permanent life. The line between farmer, trader, and warrior was fluid. All were bound by the same code of honor and the same fascination with what lay beyond the horizon. But the spirit that drove them outward was not greed alone. It was restlessness, a hunger deeply embedded in the human condition, amplified by the northern landscape. When land is scarce and winters are long, motion becomes the natural answer. The sea offered escape, opportunity, and meaning. It tested courage and rewarded those willing to face uncertainty. To the Norse mind, danger was not something to be avoided, but a measure of worth. The man who faced the sea proved his strength not only to his peers, but to the gods themselves. Their beliefs gave shape to their courage. Death was not the end. It was transformation. The fallen warrior entered Valhalla, where he would feast forever under Odin's gaze, preparing for the final battle at the end of the world. This vision made fear meaningless. It taught them to see risk as a path to immortality, and in that belief, they found an inexhaustible will to explore. The sea, with all its perils, was simply another trial set by the gods. The longship itself became a symbol of that faith. It was not just a machine of wood and sail, but a manifestation of will and spirit. In life, it carried them to new lands. In death, it carried them into eternity. Some chieftains were buried in their ships, surrounded by weapons, jewelry, and food for the journey to the afterlife. Fires would be lit, or earth heaped over the vessel, turning it into a grave and monument at once. To bury a man in a ship was to honor his journey, the endless voyage between this world and the next. By the late 8th century, Scandinavia's coasts had become alive with motion. Villages echoed with the sound of hammers, saws, and voices singing as new ships took shape. The sea lanes of the Baltic and North Sea filled with traders and adventurers. The people of the North had mastered their environment, transformed hardship into skill, and turned isolation into opportunity. Their technology was unmatched, their resolve unbroken. They had everything they needed to cross into history. It was inevitable that curiosity would become ambition. Across the water lay Britain and Ireland lands, divided into small kingdoms, rich with monasteries and churches that held silver, books, and treasure. The Norse knew of them through trade and rumor. They knew they were wealthy, and they knew they were vulnerable. The same ships that carried goods could carry warriors. The same winds that carried traders to friendly shores could carry raiders to unguarded ones. And so, as summer returned each year, the first longships began to push farther out into the open sea. Before the age of conquest began, however, it was an age of learning. Every voyage added to their knowledge, the direction of currents, the temperament of tides, the hidden dangers of coasts. They mapped the world not on parchment, but in memory. A good navigator could sense land by smell, by the pattern of waves, or the taste of the air. They became one with the sea, listening to its language in ways modern sailors can only imagine. Each expedition made the next easier, faster, more daring. Slowly, the invisible borders of the North expanded. The transformation of the Norse world was almost complete. In just a few generations, a people once bound by geography had learned to master the very force that confined them. Their ships could now travel hundreds of miles without sight of land. Their courage had been tempered by centuries of survival, their faith by centuries of myth. They were not yet the Vikings of legend, but everything that made that legend possible had already taken shape. The sea had taught them all it could. Now it was time to act. In the final years of the 8th century, the first fleets began to gather along the coasts of Norway and Denmark. The air was filled with the smell of tar and salt, the sounds of gulls and hammers. Families watched from the shore as young men loaded supplies, checked their sails, and pushed their ships toward the horizon. They did not yet know what they would find, nor how far their journeys would carry them. But the sea was calling, and the people of the north were ready to answer. Soon, these ships would reach foreign shores. They would arrive first as traders, then as raiders, and finally as settlers and kings. Their sails would darken the horizons of Europe, and their language, art, and stories would leave marks that still echo today. Yet all of it, the raids, the voyages, the empires to come, began here, in this moment of awakening, when the sea became more than a boundary. It became the path forward, the teacher that had prepared them for everything to come. The horizon was open. The winds were steady. The age of exploration was beginning. By the end of the 8th century, Scandinavia was no longer isolated. Its people had grown strong through hardship and resourcefulness. Their ships, once confined to coastal waters, now cut through the open sea with confidence. Trade routes connected them to Europe, the Baltic, and beyond. They had seen foreign lands, foreign wealth, and the weaknesses of those who lived there. The Norse were poised on the threshold of a new age. They had the skill to travel farther, the hunger to seek more, and the courage to take it. The world beyond the fjords was about to feel their arrival. In the year 793, a fleet of ships appeared on the horizon of the northeastern coast of England. Their destination was Lindisfarne, a small island just off the coast of Northumbria. It was a peaceful place home to a monastery famous for its learning, its wealth, and its holiness. For decades, Lindisfarne had stood as one of Christianity's northern outposts, a beacon of faith in a world still half wild. Monks tended their gardens, copied sacred texts by hand, and prayed in the quiet rhythm of the tides. They could not have imagined that their tranquil island would become the stage for one of the most shocking events in early medieval history. When the Vikings landed, they came without warning. They moved quickly, their longships slicing through the shallows, their oars flashing in the sun. The monks may have seen them from the shore and assumed they were traders. They had seen ships before Scandinavian merchants, occasionally visited Britain's coasts to exchange furs and amber for silver or grain. But this time, something was different. The men who stepped ashore wore armor and carried axes. Within moments, the silence of the island was broken by shouting, the clash of steel, and the sound of fire. What happened next would be remembered for centuries. The Vikings stormed the monastery, looting its treasures and killing or enslaving many of its inhabitants. Gold and silver objects, holy relics, and decorated books were carried away. The monks who resisted were struck down, while others were taken as captives, destined to be sold as slaves or ransomed for wealth. The attack was brutal and swift. For the people of Christian Europe, it was more than a crime. It was an unthinkable violation. The invaders had struck not at a fortress or an army, but at a sacred site dedicated to God. It seemed to many that the end of days had come. News of the raid spread quickly across the continent. Letters and chronicles from the time record the horror and disbelief it caused. Alcuin of York, a scholar serving in the court of Charlemagne, wrote with anguish about the attack. "Never before has such terror appeared in Britain," he said, "as we have now suffered from a pagan race. The heathens desecrated the sanctuary of God, shed the blood of saints around the altar, and trampled on the bodies of the holy in the temple of God, like dung in the streets." For him and his contemporaries, the raid was more than violence. It was divine punishment, a sign that God was angry with his people. In their eyes, the Vikings were not merely men from the north. They were instruments of wrath. To the Norse themselves, however, the attack was something else entirely. Lindisfarne was not a holy site in their eyes. It was a wealthy one. Monasteries were perfect targets, rich, isolated, and poorly defended. The Vikings did not see sacrilege in their actions. They saw opportunity. Their own gods demanded courage and rewarded success. Taking treasure from those too weak to defend, it was not evil, it was proof of strength. In their world, glory and wealth were intertwined, and both could be won by those bold enough to seize them. It is likely that the attack on Lindisfarne was not the first Viking raid, only the first that was widely recorded. Other smaller assaults may have occurred earlier along the English and Irish coasts, going unnoticed by history. But Lindisfarne's fame made it different. The monastery was a center of Christian learning, home to sacred relics and illuminated manuscripts. Its destruction sent shockwaves through the known world. From this moment onward, the word Viking would become synonymous with fear. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, written years later, remembered the event with dread. In this year, fierce, foreboding omens came over the land of Northumbria, it said. There were immense flashes of lightning, and fiery dragons were seen flying in the air. A great famine soon followed, and after that, on the 6th day before the Ides of June, the ravages of heathen men miserably destroyed God's church at Lindisfarne. The entry blends fact with symbolism: storms, famine, and dragons, all seen as warnings of the disaster to come. It reflected the deep shock of a people who had never before been attacked from the sea. The reality of the raid was both simple and profound. The Vikings had discovered a weakness in the world beyond Scandinavia. The coasts of Britain, Ireland, and northern France were dotted with wealthy but poorly defended monasteries. Their treasures were immense: gold chalices, jeweled crosses, fine silver vessels, and manuscripts bound in ornate covers. To men from the north, these riches were unimaginable. The monasteries also held something else of value, people. Slaves were a profitable trade commodity in the early medieval world, and the Vikings quickly realized that captives could be ransomed or sold for great profit. The same ships that carried warriors could just as easily carry human cargo. Archaeological evidence supports the accounts of violence. On Lindisfarne, remnants of the destruction have been found: broken crosses, burned structures, and a carved stone known as the Doomsday Stone, depicting armed figures believed to represent the attackers. The image is haunting, a reminder of how suddenly the old world of peace and prayer was shattered by the arrival of strangers from the sea. Yet even in their brutality, the Vikings revealed something more complex than mindless savagery. They were not raiding at random. They had chosen their target carefully, likely based on knowledge gained through trade and prior contact. Lindisfarne was wealthy, accessible by sea, and isolated enough that resistance would be slow to arrive. The raid was not chaos, it was strategy. The success at Lindisfarne inspired others. Word would have spread quickly through the ports and villages of Scandinavia. Tales of treasure, slaves, and glory would have ignited imaginations across the north. The following years saw more ships set sail, more raids launched, and more coasts targeted. What began as isolated acts of piracy soon became a pattern of seasonal warfare. Each summer, fleets of longships crossed the North Sea, striking at monasteries, villages, and trade centers along the British and Irish coasts. They attacked Jarrow, Iona, and Bangor, places once thought too remote to fear invasion. They came in waves, swift, unpredictable, unstoppable. To those they attacked, the Vikings seemed almost supernatural. Their sudden appearances and disappearances defied logic. They seemed to rise from the mist, strike with lightning speed, and vanish before armies could gather. Their longships allowed them to travel up rivers, deep into the heart of kingdoms, bypassing fortifications entirely. They struck not only at coasts, but at inland towns, taking what they wanted, and then retreating to the safety of the sea. To the people of Britain and Ireland, they were a nightmare made real. To the Norse, it was opportunity made manifest. The motives behind the raids were not purely greed or cruelty. Economic and social pressures back home made raiding an appealing choice for ambitious young men. The population in Scandinavia was growing, land was limited, and inheritance laws left many sons without farms of their own. Raiding offered a path to wealth and status. It provided silver, slaves, and stories currency that could elevate a man's reputation and secure followers. In a culture that valued honor and generosity, a successful raid could transform a common man into a chieftain. The rewards were enormous, but so were the risks. Not every ship returned. Raiding also offered adventure, the thrill of the unknown. For men raised on tales of gods and heroes, to cross the sea and face danger was to live the stories they had grown up hearing. The sea called to them, as it always had, but now it called them toward conflict as well as discovery. Each voyage became a test of endurance, faith, and ambition. The Vikings believed that fate or word governed every life, but courage could shape its course. To meet one's destiny on the field or the sea was to fulfill one's purpose. By the early 9th century, Viking raids had become an annual reality for Europe. They no longer struck only at isolated monasteries, but began targeting larger settlements and trading centers. Their understanding of local geography and politics improved with each campaign. They learned which kingdoms were divided, which coasts were undefended, and which leaders could be bribed instead of fought. Over time, raiding evolved into something more organized. The Vikings began wintering in foreign lands, establishing semi-permanent camps from which they could raid inland during the warmer months. What began as plunder was slowly becoming conquest. The attack on Lindisfarne marked more than the beginning of the Viking Age. It marked the beginning of cultural collision. The raids brought Scandinavia into direct contact with Christian Europe. Over the next centuries, that contact would transform both worlds. The Vikings would carry their culture, art, and beliefs across the continent, even as they absorbed elements of the lands they touched. The same men who burned monasteries would later build churches. The same ships that carried raiders would later carry settlers and kings. But in these early years, the focus was survival and success. The Norse learned quickly from their encounters. They realized that striking from the sea gave them power that no land-based army could match. They were fast, mobile, and unpredictable. They began to coordinate larger fleets, sometimes composed of dozens of ships. Each expedition brought more wealth, and with it, more followers. The Viking world was changing. What had begun as the act of a few daring men was becoming a movement that would reshape Europe. Across the North Sea, fear grew. Monks and chroniclers wrote prayers for deliverance. Kings built defenses along the coasts, and towns began to fortify themselves. Yet for decades, no one could stop the raids. The sea, which had always protected the British Isles, now betrayed them. The very waters that separated them from the continent had become the highway of their enemies. The Norse had turned the world's boundaries inside out. Still, to understand the Vikings only as raiders is to miss the full story. Their voyages were not simply acts of violence, but acts of expansion of contact between worlds. Through their travels, they connected distant cultures, opened new trade routes, and exchanged knowledge and technology. They were both destroyers and builders, explorers and settlers. Their story, even in its bloodiest chapters, was also one of discovery. And it began, as all great human journeys do, with curiosity, courage, and the call of the unknown. The attack on Lindisfarne was the spark, but the fire it lit would burn for centuries. Soon, the Vikings would move beyond raiding to establish settlements, trade networks, and even kingdoms. They would sail to Ireland, France, and Russia, and eventually to Iceland, Greenland, and North America. But everything the exploration, the transformation, the blending of cultures traces its origins to that summer day in 793, when a handful of longships emerged from the mist and changed history forever. In the years following the attack on Lindisfarne, Europe began to change. The memory of that first raid lingered like a shadow over the North Sea. Word of the heathen men from the north spread quickly through England, Ireland, and the Frankish realms. For many, it was as though an ancient prophecy had come true. A people from beyond the edges of the known world had risen to test Christendom itself. But to the Norse, this was only the beginning of a new way of life. The same sea that had carried their ancestors to trade now carried them toward power. The raids multiplied. Monks on the coasts of Britain and Ireland learned to watch the horizon with dread. The next known attacks came in 794 and 795, striking the monasteries at Jarrow, Iona, and Bangor centers of learning that had preserved centuries of religious tradition. The Vikings came in small bands at first, usually a handful of ships, but their movements were swift and precise. They landed, took what they wanted, and vanished again before the local armies could gather. The element of surprise was their greatest weapon, and their ships gave them the freedom to appear anywhere at any time. Each summer brought new raids, and each year the attacks grew bolder. In 802, the monastery on Iona, the resting place of St. Columba, was burned. The following year, it was attacked again. The Irish annals speak of great slaughter among the clergy, and of monks fleeing into exile. The survivors carried their relics and manuscripts inland, away from the sea that had once protected them. But there was no true refuge. The Vikings followed the rivers deep into the interior, turning every waterway into a potential invasion route. By 820, no coast in the British Isles felt safe. The Norse had learned the tides, the geography, and the defenses of the land. They began to stay longer each season, sometimes wintering in sheltered bays or building temporary camps along the coasts. These camps became bases for extended campaigns, allowing them to raid year-round. What had begun as opportunistic plundering was slowly evolving into something far more organized. To understand how the Vikings succeeded so completely, one must look at their ships and tactics. Their longships were more than vessels. They were extensions of their strategy. With shallow drafts, they could sail up rivers where no one expected them, bypassing natural defenses and reaching targets far inland. They could land on open beaches without docks or harbors, strike, and then leave before any response could form. On land, their discipline was remarkable. Despite their reputation for chaos, Viking raiding parties often acted with military precision. They divided into units, assigned tasks, and moved quickly, taking advantage of confusion and fear. The sound of a Viking raid was unforgettable. The deep beat of oars, the creak of timber, the shouts of men, and the blare of war horns. Smoke would soon follow, rising from burning villages and churches. Yet for all their ferocity, the Norse were not driven by cruelty alone. To them, the raids were a dangerous but honorable way to gain wealth and reputation. Many of those who raided were also traders. The same ships that brought terror one season could return the next carrying goods to sell. This duality, merchant and warrior, builder and destroyer, defined the Viking world. The reaction of Christian Europe was mixed with both fear and fascination. Chroniclers described the raiders as devils, monsters, or divine punishment, but others recognized their skill and courage. Some leaders saw opportunity in contact with them. In the Frankish Empire, Charlemagne's successors attempted diplomacy, offering trade and tribute to keep the raiders at bay. For a time, it worked. But wealth always attracted more ships, and peace rarely lasted long. The Vikings soon realized that Europe's wealth was not limited to monasteries. Towns and ports offered richer rewards. In 834, they attacked Dorestad, a major trading center in modern-day Netherlands, several times over successive years. The raids were so profitable that Dorestad's economy collapsed. From there, the Norse turned their attention to France, sailing up the Seine and the Loire. They plundered Rouen, Nantes, and eventually Paris itself. In 845, a fleet led by the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, or someone like him, for the line between history and saga blurs, sailed up the Seine with more than 100 ships. Paris was ransacked, and the Frankish king, Charles the Bald, paid a massive ransom in silver to make them leave. It was a pattern that would repeat again and again. Destruction followed by negotiation, and negotiation followed by tribute. To the Franks, these payments were an act of desperation. To the Vikings, they were simply another form of trade. They called such payments Danegeld, the Danish gold. It became one of the most effective and controversial tools of Viking power. By offering silver, kings could buy peace, but peace only lasted as long as the silver did. Once word spread that a ransom had been paid, more fleets came seeking the same reward. The system fed itself, turning warfare into commerce. Meanwhile, the British Isles descended into crisis. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, Northumbria, Mercia, Wessex, and East Anglia, were often divided and at war with one another. Their disunity made them vulnerable. The Vikings exploited these divisions skillfully, sometimes fighting for one king against another, sometimes attacking both. By the middle of the 9th century, Viking armies were no longer small raiding parties. They were large coalitions, bringing together warriors from Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. These were the so-called Great Heathen Armies, forces capable of conquering and holding territory. The first of these arrived in England in 865. It was led, according to later chronicles, by the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan, and Ubba. Over the next decade, they marched across England, capturing city after city. Northumbria fell first, its capital York becoming a Viking stronghold. East Anglia followed, its king executed for refusing to abandon his faith. By 878, only Wessex remained free under its young king Alfred. The war between Alfred and the Vikings would shape the future of England. But at this stage of the story, the transformation of the Viking world was just beginning. Even as their raids ravaged Europe, the Norse themselves were changing. The wealth they gained abroad flowed back into Scandinavia, enriching their homelands. Silver coins from Baghdad, Frankish jewelry, and English weapons filled burial sites across the north. Trade centers grew around key harbors like Hedeby in Denmark and Birka in Sweden. These towns became hubs of commerce and culture, linking the Viking world to the great empires of the south and east. The Vikings were not isolated pirates. They were participants in a vast network that stretched from the Atlantic to the Black Sea. The raids also began to influence the way others saw the sea. For centuries, the waters of the North Atlantic had been regarded as impassable barriers, dividing nations. The Vikings proved they were highways, connecting worlds. Their mastery of navigation and shipbuilding inspired other cultures to rethink their relationship with the ocean. Over time, their influence would spread not only through conquest, but through imitation. Despite their growing power, life for the Viking raiders remained perilous. The sea was as deadly as any enemy. Storms could destroy entire fleets, and foreign diseases or counterattacks could wipe out crews. Captured Vikings were often executed without mercy. Yet they returned to the sea again and again. To them, danger was the price of freedom. The promise of silver and glory outweighed the risk of death. And even death itself was not defeat, for a warrior who died bravely would find his way to Valhalla. It is tempting to imagine the early Viking Age as an endless wave of violence. But beneath the raids ran something deeper: curiosity, skill, and the drive to explore. Every voyage expanded their understanding of the world. They discovered new lands and peoples, and in doing so, they discovered themselves. The raiders who left Norway and Denmark were also the navigators who would one day find Iceland, Greenland, and even North America. The impulse that led them to plunder monasteries was the same that would lead them to map the edges of the world. The Viking Age was as much about expansion of the mind as of empire. As Europe struggled to defend itself, it also began to change in response. The constant raids forced kingdoms to fortify towns, build navies, and strengthen their borders. Coastal defenses were established, and local militias formed to repel invaders. Over time, these adaptations would give rise to more centralized governments and professional armies. In a paradoxical way, the Vikings helped forge the very political order that would one day end their dominance. The raids also sparked cultural exchange. Though the first encounters were violent, trade soon followed. Captured slaves, foreign goods, and ideas moved in both directions. Viking artisans learned new techniques from Frankish metalworkers, while European craftsmen adopted Norse designs. Even religion began to flow across the sea. Christian missionaries ventured north, seeking to convert the very people who had once burned their churches. In time, they would succeed, but not yet. For now, the North still belonged to the old gods, and the sea remained their domain. The Norse saw omens in every voyage, signs of fate in the cry of gulls and the shape of clouds. They believed their gods guided the wind and waves, testing the hearts of those who dared to sail. To them, the raids were not acts of cruelty, but expressions of destiny, a fulfillment of the courage their ancestors had taught them. And though their victims saw only destruction, the Vikings saw creation, the forging of new paths, the expansion of a world too long confined. For now, the North still belonged to the old gods, and the sea remained their domain. The Norse saw omens in every voyage, signs of fate in the cry of gulls and the shape of clouds. They believed their gods guided the wind and waves, testing the hearts of those who dared to sail. To them, the raids were not acts of cruelty, but expressions of destiny, a fulfillment of the courage their ancestors had taught them. And though their victims saw only destruction, the Vikings saw creation, the forging of new paths, the expansion of a world too long confined. By the middle of the 9th century, the raids that had once shocked Europe had become an annual rhythm, a tide that rose and fell with the seasons. Every summer, fleets of longships slipped out of Scandinavian harbors, fanning across the North Sea toward Britain, Ireland, and the coasts of the Frankish Empire. What began as a sudden eruption of violence had matured into a complex system of exploration, trade, and migration. The Vikings were no longer simply raiders. They were becoming settlers, colonists, and eventually rulers. The age of plunder was giving way to the age of expansion. The transformation did not happen overnight. The early raiders had come for treasure and slaves, not land. But as the decades passed, some began to see the foreign shores differently. They saw fertile soil, gentle climates, and opportunities unavailable in their crowded homelands. The same scarcity that had once driven them to raid now drove them to stay. Scandinavia was rugged and limited in arable land. In contrast, the river valleys of England, the plains of Ireland, and the farmlands of northern France seemed rich and endless. For men who had grown up scraping life from thin soil, these lands must have looked like paradise. The shift from raiding to settlement was gradual and practical. Many Vikings who came as warriors returned home with silver and stories, but others remained through winter, repairing ships, trading with locals, and exploring inland. Over time, temporary camps became permanent bases. These wintering stations, as they were called, were usually built along rivers or sheltered coasts, where ships could be pulled ashore for repair. The camps provided security, resources, and the first steps toward colonization. Archaeological remains of these encampments, such as those at Repton in England and Woodstown in Ireland, show how quickly the Vikings adapted from raiders to residents. The great heathen army, which had landed in England in 865, was the turning point. Unlike earlier raiding bands, this was an organized force intent on conquest. It moved systematically across the island, capturing cities and demanding tribute. Northumbria fell first, followed by East Anglia and Mercia. Only Wessex resisted, under the leadership of Alfred the Great. After years of war, a treaty was reached in 878, dividing England into two spheres, the south under Anglo-Saxon control and the north and east under Viking rule. This region became known as the Danelaw, a term describing both territory and law. Within its boundaries, Norse customs, language, and governance took root. The establishment of the Danelaw marked one of the most significant cultural fusions in medieval Europe. The Norse settlers brought their traditions of assembly and lawgiving, which blended with Anglo-Saxon systems of governance. The local councils, known as things where free men gathered to resolve disputes and make decisions, were maintained and adapted. Old Norse words entered the English language, many of which remain today: sky, window, knife, husband, law. Towns with names ending in by Thorpe or Thwaite still mark the places where Scandinavians once lived. York, known to them as Jorvik, became the heart of their power in England, a thriving city of trade and craftsmanship, filled with workshops, markets, and ships from across the seas. In Ireland, the pattern was similar but more fragmented. The first Viking bases there were established around 841, when fleets began wintering along the coast. From these bases grew towns: Dublin, Wexford, Waterford, Limerick, and Cork, all founded by Norse settlers. Dublin, in particular, became a major center of trade and politics. Its harbor connected Ireland to the wider Viking world, linking routes that stretched from the North Atlantic to the Mediterranean and beyond. The Norse-Irish settlements became melting pots of culture, where pagan warriors traded with Christian monks and Gaelic chieftains. Intermarriage was common, and over time, the line between Norse and Irish blurred. Many Vikings converted to Christianity, adopted local customs, and formed alliances with native kings. By the 10th century, the descendants of these settlers, sometimes called the Hiberno Norse, had become part of Ireland's political landscape. On the continent, the Vikings followed a similar pattern. Raids along the rivers of France became so frequent that the Franks were forced to negotiate. In 911, the Frankish king Charles the Simple made a pragmatic offer to the Viking leader Rollo: land in exchange for peace. Rollo accepted, and the region of Normandy, the land of the Northmen, was born. The arrangement was mutually beneficial. Rollo and his followers gained legitimate control of rich territory, while the Franks secured their northern frontier. In return, Rollo agreed to convert to Christianity and defend the realm from other raiders. Within a generation, the Norse settlers of Normandy had become French in language and culture, though their spirit of ambition and adaptability remained. It was from this lineage that, a century and a half later, William the Conqueror, Rollo's descendant, would launch his invasion of England in 1066, forever intertwining Viking legacy with European destiny. Across these new lands, the Vikings brought more than swords. They brought systems of trade, craftsmanship, and communication that reshaped the medieval world. Their settlements became hubs in a network that spanned continents. From Dublin, York, and Rouen, goods flowed in every direction: silver from the Middle East, silk from Byzantium, amber from the Baltic, furs from Russia, and slaves from conquered lands. Viking merchants traveled vast distances, using rivers as highways into the heart of Europe. They followed the Rhine, the Elbe, and the Danube, and farther east. They journeyed along the Volga and Dnieper, reaching as far as the markets of Constantinople and the Caliphate of Baghdad. To these distant civilizations, the northern traders were known as the Rus or the Varangians. Their voyages would lay the foundations for new states in Eastern Europe, including the early kingdom of Kiev and Rus. The growth of these trade routes changed life back in Scandinavia. Ports like Hedeby in Denmark and Birka in Sweden flourished as centers of commerce. Archaeologists have uncovered coins from Arabia, beads from India, and glass from the Mediterranean in their ruins. The Vikings were not isolated pirates. They were global participants in a vast economic system. Their ships carried not only plunder, but ideas, technologies, and beliefs. Through trade and contact, the Norse learned new building methods, artistic styles, and agricultural techniques. They were as quick to adapt as they were to explore. The Viking expansion also transformed their social structure. Wealth from abroad concentrated in the hands of powerful chieftains, who built larger households and gathered loyal warriors known as herdmen. These leaders commissioned monumental ship burials and runestones, celebrating their deeds and lineages. The inscriptions often blended pride with poetry memorials, not only to individuals, but to a way of life centered on courage, honor, and remembrance. Society became increasingly hierarchical, laying the groundwork for the emergence of kingship in Scandinavia. Figures like Harald Fairhair in Norway and Gorm the Old in Denmark began uniting smaller tribes under centralized rule. Their power, bolstered by trade and tribute, marked the beginning of the transition from Viking warbands to medieval kingdoms. As Norse settlers spread across Europe, they also underwent profound cultural change. The contact with Christian lands introduced them to new ideas about law, morality, and governance. While many resisted conversion at first, the appeal of Christian alliances and legitimacy proved strong. By adopting the faith of their neighbors, Viking leaders could secure peace, trade, and recognition. Baptism became as much a political act as a spiritual one. Over time, churches began to appear in Viking towns, often built on the ruins of old pagan temples. Crosses stood beside runestones, symbols of two worlds merging. Yet even as they embraced new faiths, the Vikings did not lose their connection to the old. Their sagas and myths continued to shape their identity, preserving memories of Odin, Thor, and Freya long after their temples fell silent. In these stories, the gods were flawed and human, bound by fate just as mortals were. The Norse worldview remained one of endurance and understanding that all things end, and that meaning lies in how one meets that end. This philosophy, forged in the cold north and tempered by centuries of struggle, gave the Vikings their unique resilience as they navigated a changing world. The expansion of the Viking world was not only a story of conquest, but of adaptation. In every land they touched, they left behind traces of their presence words, artifacts, traditions, but they also absorbed the influences of those they encountered. Their culture was fluid, shaped by exchange as much as by force. The Norse who settled in Ireland became part of Irish society. Those in Normandy became French. Those in the East became Slavic. The sea that once divided them from the world had made them part of it. Life in the Viking settlements was demanding but dynamic. In the towns of the Danelaw, blacksmiths forged weapons and tools, weavers made cloth, and traders bartered in markets, filled with noise and color. Ships arrived with cargoes of salt, grain, and timber. Children grew up hearing stories of the old homeland of fjords, longhouses, and endless winters, but many would never see it. They were born into a new world, a fusion of Norse and local traditions. Their homes were built differently, their speech mixed languages, their faith combined elements of both pagan and Christian belief. The Viking Age had begun as an explosion of violence, but it was evolving into a story of transformation. By the end of the 10th century, the Viking presence stretched across Europe. From the shores of Newfoundland to the steppes of Russia, their influence could be felt. They were farmers and craftsmen, traders and rulers, explorers and poets. The longships still sailed, but now they carried settlers as often as warriors. The world was shrinking, connected by the same winds that once carried raiders across unknown seas. The Norse had turned the margins of the map into the center of movement and exchange. The legacy of the Viking expansion was not measured only in battles won or lands conquered, but in connections made. They linked continents and cultures, blending traditions and reshaping identities. The Europe that emerged from the Viking Age was a more connected, diverse, and dynamic place. Yet the spirit that had driven the first explorers from their fjords, the hunger to see what lay beyond the horizon, remained unchanged. The sea still called to them, and its call would carry them farther still. Beyond the settled lands of Britain and France, the Norse began to push westward again. Rumors spread of new islands, of unclaimed coasts rising from the mists of the Atlantic. Sailors spoke of places where the grass grew tall and the air was thick with the scent of salt and rain. These whispers would soon lead them into the open ocean once more, to the edge of the known world. There, in the vast and silent waters, the next chapter of their story would unfold. The world that the Vikings built across Europe was unlike anything the early monks of Lindisfarne could have imagined. What had begun as a terror from the sea was slowly transforming into a network of thriving, interconnected communities. The Norse settlers were practical people, and wherever they landed, they adapted swiftly to local conditions. In England, they adopted the plow patterns of their Anglo-Saxon neighbors and improved their methods of farming. In Ireland, they mastered inland river routes that carried trade deep into the countryside. In France, they learned to cultivate vineyards and wheat fields. Each new land reshaped them, and in turn, they reshaped each land. In their settlements, life revolved around the rhythm of the seasons. Spring was for planting, summer for trade, autumn for harvest, and winter for storytelling and craft. Markets were the heart of Viking towns' open spaces alive with sound and color. Traders from across Europe bartered in silver and goods, weighing coins on bronze scales. The air smelled of salt, tar, and smoke. Craftsmen hammered iron, carved bone, and dyed cloth in deep reds and blues. Ships lined the harbors like a forest of masts, their sails drying in the sun. The markets were not only centers of commerce, but of communication, places where languages and ideas flowed as freely as goods. The role of women in these communities was significant. Norse women enjoyed a level of independence unusual for the medieval world. They could own property, inherit wealth, and manage farms in their husband's absence. Many were merchants and traders in their own right. Grave findings from across the Viking world show women buried with keys, scales, and jewelry, symbols of authority and status. In the sagas, women were portrayed as wise and willful, guiding their households and, at times, shaping the fate of clans and kingdoms. In settlement life, their labor sustained the community, weaving sails, preserving food, managing trade accounts, and maintaining kinship ties that stretched across seas. They were the quiet architects of stability in a culture born of motion. Art flourished alongside trade. The Norse decorated everyday objects, combs, weapons, cups, and tools, with intricate patterns of animals and interlacing lines. These designs reflected their belief that the world was alive with hidden energy. Every curve of a beast, or knot of lines, symbolizing the flow of life and fate. Wood carving was especially valued. Ships, doors, and temples were covered with spiraling motifs that blended myth and geometry. The famous Oseberg ship burial, discovered in Norway, revealed the height of their craftsmanship. A vessel carved with dragons, serpents, and vines so fluid they seemed to move even in stillness. Such artistry followed them wherever they went, carried in memory, habit, and hand. Religion, too, evolved in the settlements. At first, the old gods of the north traveled with them. Small wooden idols of Thor and Freya have been found buried in the ruins of Dublin and York, standing beside crosses and Christian relics. The coexistence of faiths was pragmatic rather than ideological. The Norse respected power wherever they found it. A man might pray to Christ before a voyage and to Thor during a storm. Over time, however, as trade deepened and intermarriage increased, Christianity began to take hold. Missionaries who once fled from raids now arrived with gifts and agreements. Conversion often began at the top, when chieftains or kings accepted baptism for political alliance and spread slowly downward through society. The process was less a sudden shift than a long blending, a quiet merging of belief systems. Even when the cross replaced the hammer, the Norse instinct for revering nature, fate, and honor endured. One of the most remarkable aspects of Viking expansion was their talent for law and governance. The thing a communal assembly that predated the Viking Age was carried into every new territory. It served as both a court and a parliament, where free men gathered to settle disputes and make decisions. The law was spoken aloud, memorized, and recited by officials known as law speakers, who preserved tradition through word rather than writing. Justice relied on balance and restitution rather than imprisonment. Compensation, known as wergild, was paid to settle feuds and restore peace. This emphasis on spoken law reflected the oral nature of Norse culture, where memory and reputation carried more weight than documents. Even after conversion and integration, this tradition of open assembly left a deep imprint on European political culture. Echoes of the thing can be seen centuries later in parliaments and councils across the continent. As Viking towns grew, they became cosmopolitan crossroads. In Jorvik, Arabic coins mingled with Irish brooches and Frankish glassware. In Dublin, Norse metalworkers forged swords stamped with English patterns. In Normandy, the descendants of raiders spoke French, but still gave their sons Norse names. Slaves from across Europe lived alongside freedmen, artisans, and traders. The Viking world was one of fluid identities, where belonging was defined more by allegiance and opportunity than by blood. To survive in such a world required adaptability, a trait the Norse possessed in abundance. The cultural exchange went both ways. Christianity introduced new art, literacy, and architecture to the north. The Norse began to carve stone crosses decorated with runes and interlaced animals, merging pagan and Christian symbolism. In England and Ireland, churches with Viking-influenced ornamentation appeared, their doorways framed by dragons and knotwork. Meanwhile, the Norse language absorbed Latin and Celtic words, and the sagas later preserved not only their own legends, but echoes of foreign tales. Through contact, the Vikings expanded their understanding of the world and their place within it. They began to see themselves not merely as outsiders, but as participants in a broader human story. Daily life in the settlements was both ordinary and extraordinary. A typical household included a family, servants, and laborers, all living under one roof. Meals were communal, built around stews of meat and vegetables, cooked in great cauldrons. In winter, the hearth was the center of warmth and storytelling. Tales of Odin's wanderings and Thor's battles mixed with accounts of real voyages and kings. The line between myth and memory blurred, and each generation added new verses to the story of their people. Children learned by listening, watching, and doing. Skills were passed down through craft boat building, smithing, weaving, ensuring continuity, even as the world around them changed. The Viking settlements also brought innovation in shipbuilding and navigation. As their journeys expanded, so did their ships. The sturdy Nair, broader and deeper than the longship, became the preferred vessel for long-distance trade and colonization. It could carry cargo across oceans, from livestock to timber to families and their belongings. These ships would eventually carry the Norse beyond the British Isles, across the northern seas to Iceland, Greenland, and beyond. Every plank and sail embodied centuries of adaptation to the sea, a reminder that their greatest technology was born not in war, but in understanding nature. While their reach extended westward, their political structures at home grew stronger. In Denmark, Harald Bluetooth unified his kingdom and proclaimed it Christian, erecting great rune stones to mark the achievement. In Norway, Harald Fairhair consolidated power through alliances and warfare, laying the foundation for a national monarchy. These unifications were as much cultural as political, binding diverse tribes under shared symbols and stories. The Viking Age, once characterized by scattered chieftains, was entering its mature phase, a civilization confident in its power yet increasingly drawn into the orbit of European politics and religion. The human cost of this transformation was not forgotten. Beneath the prosperity and cultural flowering lay the echoes of violence and displacement. The same ships that carried settlers also carried captives. Slavery remained a part of the Viking economy, feeding the demand of markets in the Islamic world and southern Europe. Many who were taken in raids ended their days far from home. Yet even in this darker aspect, the Vikings were not unique. They participated in an economic system that bound much of the medieval world. To understand their age fully is to see its complexity, a blend of brutality and creativity, of conquest and coexistence. By the close of the 10th century, the great Viking expansion had reshaped Europe. Kingdoms that once trembled at the sight of their sails now counted Viking-descended rulers among their monarchs. Trade routes crisscrossed the continent, linking the icy fjords of Norway to the warm markets of Byzantium. The Norse had moved from the margins to the center of world affairs. Yet the spirit that had first driven them outward, the restless curiosity of a people shaped by the sea, remained alive. The frontiers of the known world still called to them. Across the ocean, beyond the horizon's pale line, there were rumors of new lands, untouched, unclaimed, waiting beneath the clouds. Those who settled in the Danelaw, in Dublin, or in Normandy had found stability, but not all were content. Some longed for the open sea, for the thrill of discovery unbound by kings or treaties. For them, the world still felt wide and unfinished. The sea had not yet revealed all its secrets. And so, once again, ships would be built, supplies gathered, and sails raised toward the westward Iceland, Greenland, and finally, the distant shores of Vinland. The age of settlement had fulfilled one dream, a home across the sea, but it had also awakened another, older hunger, the desire to stand at the edge of the world and see what lay beyond. By the late 9th century, the Norse world stretched farther than ever before. From the green fields of England to the rivers of Russia, their presence could be felt in every corner of the north. Yet for a people shaped by the horizon, even this was not enough. The same spirit that had carried them from fjord to foreign shore still burned quietly in their hearts. Yearning for new lands, for open space, for the sound of the ocean against the hull of a ship. The sea was both memory and promise, and it called again, westward this time, toward the edge of the known world. It began with whispers of islands. Sailors returning from the North Atlantic spoke of lands glimpsed through fog places where seabirds nested in cliffs, where the grass grew high, and where no one lived. The stories may have reached Norway through traders, exiles, or wandering seafarers. To the Norse, such tales were irresistible. Their homelands were becoming crowded, ruled now by emerging kings who demanded loyalty and tribute. Some chafed under these new hierarchies. They longed for independence, for the freedom their ancestors had known. The West offered that chance a place to begin again, to build without kings, to live by one's own hand. The first step westward led to the Faroe Islands, a scattering of rocky peaks in the cold Atlantic, halfway between Norway and Iceland. Small groups of settlers arrived there around the mid-9th century, bringing sheep, cattle, and grain. The land was harsh, but the sea provided fish and seabirds in abundance. These islands became stepping stones, staging posts for those who dreamed of venturing farther. From the Faroes, the line of sight extended toward a greater mystery, the vast island later known as Iceland. According to tradition, the discovery of Iceland was accidental. A Norwegian sailor named Nadad was blown off course on his way to the Faroe Islands sometime around 860. He sighted a mountainous coast rising through the mist and called it Snæland, the land of snow. Others followed. Gardar Svavarson, a Swede, circumnavigated the island a few years later and confirmed that it was surrounded by sea. Then came Floki Vilgerharson, remembered as Raven Floki for the birds he carried with him. He released ravens into the sky to find land, following the one that did not return. He called the place Island Iceland after seeing ice drift along its shores. At first glance, It was not a promising home. The land was volcanic, windswept, and treeless. The soil was thin, and winters were long. Yet beneath its severity lay abundance, rich pastures, fresh water, fish-filled rivers, and untouched fields ready for settlement. To people used to crowded fjords and the rule of kings, it was paradise. In 874, a Norwegian chieftain named Ingolfur Arnarson led a group of settlers there, establishing a homestead in what is now Reykjavik. His journey marked the beginning of a great migration that would bring thousands of Norse families across the sea. Over the next half-century, settlers arrived from Norway, the Scottish Isles, and Ireland, bringing with them livestock, tools, and slaves. They built turf houses against the cold, raised sheep and cattle, and divided the land among clans. Without a king, they created their own system of governance, the Althing, one of the world's earliest parliaments, established around 930. It met each summer at Lingvellir, a broad plain where two tectonic plates meet and the earth itself seems to breathe. There, free men gathered to recite laws, settle disputes, and decide the fate of their society. It was a government born of memory and necessity, echoing the things of the old homeland, but adapted to this new world. In a landscape of fire and ice, the Norse had built a republic of law and endurance. Iceland became a haven for independence. Many who came were not merely settlers, but exiles, men and women, fleeing the growing power of kings in Scandinavia. Here they found what they sought: freedom, isolation, and the chance to live according to their own codes. The Icelanders held fast to the old gods longer than any other Norse people, worshipping Odin, Thor, and Freya beneath open skies. Yet they were also pragmatic. Trade with Christian Europe required diplomacy, and when the time came, conversion was handled not through war, but through consensus. In the year 1000, the Althing debated the issue and decided, peacefully, that Iceland would become Christian. The decision was made not by decree, but by vote, a rare moment of unity in a turbulent age. The Icelandic settlers preserved more than themselves. They preserved their culture. In the long winters, as snow sealed the valleys and the sea froze in silence, they told stories. Those stories of gods, kings, and wanderers would one day be written down as the sagas, the great literary treasures of the medieval North. These tales kept alive the memory of the old world and the spirit of exploration that had carried them here. They spoke of struggle and endurance, of honor and loss, of the fragile line between courage and fate. In the isolation of Iceland, the Norse imagination found its purest voice. But even Iceland was not the end. From its western shores, sailors could see the faint promise of farther lands. Driftwood and the bones of whales washed up from unknown coasts. The migratory paths of birds hinted at islands beyond the horizon. The ocean itself seemed to whisper of places unseen. The next step in the Norse Odyssey would carry them into even harsher waters, to a land of glaciers, cliffs, and green pastures hidden among ice. That land would be called Greenland. According to the sagas, Greenland was discovered by Gunnbjörn Olfsson, who sighted it by accident when blown off course in the early 10th century. But it was Eric the Red who made it known. Banished from Iceland for murder, Eric sailed west with his family and followers around 982. He spent 3 years exploring a vast, icy coastline, mapping fjords and naming landmarks. When he returned to Iceland, he called the new land Greenland, hoping that a pleasant name would attract settlers. His marketing worked. In 985, around 25 ships set sail to follow him. 14 arrived. They established 2 main colonies, the eastern and western settlements, along the sheltered fjords of the island's southern tip. Life in Greenland was difficult, even by Norse standards. The growing season was short, the winters brutal, and the isolation absolute. Yet for nearly 5 centuries, the colonies endured. They raised cattle and sheep, hunted seals and caribou, and traded walrus ivory with Europe in exchange for timber, iron, and cloth. Churches were built and bishops appointed. The ruins of these stone churches still stand today, ghostly and silent against the tundra. The Greenlanders maintained ties with Norway and Iceland, but over time, contact grew sporadic. When the climate cooled in the 14th century and trade routes faltered, the settlements gradually disappeared, leaving behind only bones, tools, and stories of a people who had once lived on the edge of the world. From Greenland, the Norse pushed one step farther across the Davis Strait to the coast of North America. Around the year 1000, Leif Erikson, the son of Eric the Red, set sail westward after hearing reports of land seen by another explorer, Bjarni Herjolfsson. Leif reached a place of forests, grass, and wild grapes. He called it Vinland, the land of wine. The exact location of Vinland remains uncertain, though archaeological evidence at Anso Meadows in Newfoundland confirms that the Norse reached North America centuries before Columbus. Their settlement there was small and short-lived, but it marked a profound moment in human history, the first known contact between Europe and the Americas. For the Norse, Vinland was both dream and disappointment. It offered resources, timber, furs, fertile soil, but it was far from their established world, and the native peoples they encountered, whom the sagas call Skrælings, resisted their presence. The Norse were not conquerors in this new land. They came, explored, built, and then withdrew. The settlements were abandoned within a few years. Yet their voyages proved what few had dared to imagine, that the Atlantic could be crossed, that the world was larger than anyone knew. In their ships, driven by wind and courage, the Vikings had connected the old world and the new long before the age of exploration began. The westward journeys of the Norse were acts of both necessity and imagination. They were searching for land, for freedom, for opportunity, but also for meaning. Each voyage was a dialogue between humanity and the sea, between the will to endure and the desire to discover. The ocean had been their adversary and their teacher, shaping their destiny from the beginning. In Iceland and Greenland, they found the limits of survival. In Vinland, they found the limits of reach. Beyond that, there was only the endless horizon, the eternal rhythm of wind and wave. As the centuries passed, the Norse colonies in the Atlantic faded from history. Iceland endured, but Greenland vanished, and Vinland became a legend told by fireside. The world moved on, but the memory of those journeys remained, a quiet echo of sails against the wind, of voices carried across the sea. The Vikings had traveled farther than any of their contemporaries, not in search of conquest, but of continuity, a place where the sea met sky, where the human spirit could breathe free. Their voyages to the far horizons were the culmination of everything the Viking Age had been. They embodied courage, adaptability, and the endless pull of exploration. When the last Norse ships left the shores of Vinland, they closed not only a chapter of history, but a circle of meaning. The people who had begun as wanderers among fjords had reached the edge of the world itself. And though their colonies would fade, their story remained, carried in the waves that still break against Iceland's coasts and in the wind that sweeps across Greenland's empty valleys. The sea remembers. It holds the ghost of every oar that ever touched its surface, every dream that ever crossed its horizon. The Norse came and went, but the ocean endures vast, eternal, and unchanging. It was their cradle, their highway, and their grave. And in its depths, the echoes of their journeys still whisper of that ancient longing to see what lies beyond the edge of sight, to find in the silence of the sea the reflection of the human soul. In Iceland, the Norse created something more enduring than empire, a society balanced between hardship and harmony. The island demanded discipline. Its seasons were merciless, its landscape raw and untamed. To survive, there was to learn the rhythm of the earth itself. Every family kept livestock, tended to meadows, and fished along the coast. Wood was scarce, so homes were built of stone and turf, their roofs alive with grass and moss. Inside, life revolved around the hearth. It was the center of warmth, food, and story. In the long winter nights, when snow buried the valleys and the wind howled against the walls, people gathered by the fire to listen to sagas tales of gods, heroes, and kin. These stories bound them together. They were both entertainment and moral compass, teaching courage, loyalty, and the inevitability of fate. The Icelanders developed a remarkable sense of independence. There were no kings, only chieftains, local leaders called gogr, who ruled by consensus rather than decree. The law was the foundation of order, recited from memory by the skomar, or law speaker, at the offing. To defy the law was to risk exile, a punishment more feared than death. Exile meant losing the community, being cut off from human warmth in a land where isolation could kill. The Icelandic sagas often turn on this tension between freedom and belonging, between the individual's will and the needs of the whole. Their society thrived not because it was easy, but because it demanded cooperation. Survival was a collective act. Religion in Iceland reflected the same balance. Pagan shrines stood beside early churches, and rituals blended old and new. Offerings were made to Thor for good weather, and to Christ for mercy. The conversion to Christianity around the year 1000 was handled with characteristic pragmatism. According to tradition, the decision was made after days of debate at the Althing. In the end, the assembly chose conversion as a way to preserve unity and trade. It was agreed that all would be baptized, but that old customs could continue in private. Thus, Iceland became Christian without bloodshed, an act of negotiation rather than conquest. It showed the maturity of a people who had learned to adapt without losing themselves. From Iceland's shores, the sea stretched west like a mirror of time itself. Those who ventured beyond its edge carried with them the silence of centuries, the wisdom of sailors who had read the ocean like a living text. To sail into that expanse required faith not only in gods, but in human skill. Navigators watched the flight of birds, the drift of seaweed, and the shape of waves. They felt the subtle pull of currents beneath the keel, sensing land long before it could be seen. It was a kind of intuition that no compass could match, a conversation with the elements. The voyage to Greenland tested even that mastery. The waters between Iceland and Greenland were among the most dangerous on Earth, filled with shifting ice, sudden storms, and freezing fog. Ships could vanish without trace, swallowed by the cold. Those who reached Greenland found a landscape both majestic and unforgiving. Towering cliffs rose from fjords, where icebergs drifted like mountains. Yet within the fjords were pockets of green land pastures, warmed by sunlight reflected from the ice. There the settlers built their farms, bringing with them cattle, sheep, and goats. They grew barley in the brief summers and stored hay for winter. Every resource was precious. Nothing was wasted. Life in Greenland required resilience. The growing season was short, and the cold relentless. Women spun wool from sheep, weaving thick cloaks to guard against the wind. Men hunted seals, walruses, and polar bears. The Norse traded walrus ivory, a valuable luxury in medieval Europe, for timber, iron, and tools. The colonies even supported churches and monasteries, some of which endured for centuries. Archaeologists have found delicate crosses and chalices in their ruins, evidence of a faith that persisted at the edge of the world. Yet despite their endurance, the Greenlanders were always at the mercy of the climate. When the weather cooled in the late 14th century, their crops failed, trade dwindled, and isolation deepened. Eventually, the settlements were abandoned. Whether their people starved, fled, or assimilated with the Inuit remains uncertain. Only the ruins remain stone walls, standing silent against the endless sky, monuments to the outer limits of human persistence. The discovery of Vinland marked the farthest reach of that persistence. For generations, the tales of Leif Erikson's voyage were preserved in the sagas, how he found a land rich with timber and grapes, where rivers ran wide and salmon filled the streams. The Norse built small halls there, hunted and explored. They called one camp Leifsbuffer Leif's houses. The sagas describe other expeditions, led by Leif's brother Thorvald and sister Freydis, each with their own triumphs and tragedies. Conflicts with the native peoples whom the Norse called Skrælings were inevitable. The sagas speak of misunderstandings that turned violent, of arrows and axes, of fear on both sides. These encounters were brief but profound, two worlds meeting, each seeing the other as the unknown. The Norse did not conquer Vinland, nor were they conquered by it. They stayed only for a few seasons, then left, taking their stories home. Yet even in their failure, they achieved something extraordinary. They had crossed the Atlantic using only their eyes, stars, and instincts. They had reached a continent no European would see again for nearly 500 years. For a civilization built on oral memory rather than written records, this was not a failure. It was an echo carried forward through generations, proof that the human drive to explore knows no limit. The journeys westward reveal much about who the Vikings had become by the dawn of the second millennium. They were no longer merely warriors or raiders. They were farmers, traders, poets, and dreamers, driven by the same mixture of necessity and curiosity that has always defined human progress. They had learned that power lay not only in the sword, but in endurance, the quiet strength to adapt and persist in any environment. They had sailed beyond the reach of empires, beyond the edge of maps, and found meaning not in conquest, but in connection. The legacy of these voyages outlasted their settlements. The sagas preserved not only geography, but psychology, the sense of wonder and uncertainty that comes from standing at the threshold of the unknown. In the saga of the Greenlanders and the saga of Eric the Red, one can feel the tension between hope and fear, between ambition and humility before the elements. These are not tales of victory, but of encounter with nature, with fate, and with oneself. They reflect a truth that transcends history, that exploration is never only about discovering new lands, but about discovering what it means to be human. Even centuries later, when Europe entered the age of great voyages, the echoes of the Norse remained. Their ships, their methods, their courage all had shown what was possible. The Atlantic, once thought impassable, had been crossed by hands and eyes alone. The map of the world had changed forever, even if the world did not yet know it. In the far north today, where the aurora dances across the sky and the sea glows with cold light, traces of their presence endure. Place names, artifacts, and stories still whisper of that time, when men and women followed the call of the sea into the unknown. In Iceland, you can still stand on the black shore where Ingolfur Arnarson landed and feel the same wind that filled his sails. In Greenland, the ruins of Halsey Church still rise from the grass, its stones weathered by centuries of frost and silence. And in Newfoundland, the remains of Norse halls still lie beneath the moss, their outlines faint but unmistakable. Each site is a footprint left at the edge of history, a testament to courage, endurance, and impermanence. The sea was the constant in all of it. It connected every shore, every story. It gave and it took, nurtured and destroyed. To the Norse, it was not merely a place of travel, but a living force, demanding respect. They never sought to conquer it, because they knew it could not be conquered. They learned instead to move with it, to listen to its moods, to yield when it raged, to trust when it calmed. The sea shaped not only their bodies and livelihoods, but their souls. It taught them humility, patience, and the art of letting go. When we think of the Vikings, we often picture warriors with axes and shields, storming foreign coasts. But their truest legacy lies not in war, but in wonder, the willingness to set sail into uncertainty and find meaning in the journey. The Norse who crossed the Atlantic did not build empires, but they expanded the boundaries of what was imaginable. They carried forward the oldest story of all, that humanity is always reaching outward, always searching for home, even when home lies beyond the horizon. And so, as their ships disappeared into mist and memory, the sea held their echoes, the soft rhythm of oars, the hiss of water against wood, the faint cries of gulls circling above. Their age would end, their kingdoms would fall, but their journeys would endure. They had mapped not only coastlines, but courage itself, tracing across the vastness of the world the simple truth that to live is to seek, and to seek is to remember that the world is larger than fear. The Viking Age did not end with a single battle or a sudden collapse. Like the tide that had once carried their ships across the world, it ebbed slowly, quietly, changing shape with the passage of time. The same courage that had driven the Norse to explore now turned inward, reshaping their societies, their faith, and their understanding of power. By the 11th century, the world that had once feared the Vikings was now learning to live with them, and the Vikings themselves were learning to live within a world transformed. The seeds of that transformation had been planted long before. Every raid, every voyage, every act of trade had brought the Norse into contact with foreign cultures. They had seen the wealth of Christian Europe, the order of its kingdoms, and the authority of its church. They had admired its literacy, its architecture, and the stability it seemed to promise. Slowly, what had begun as curiosity became influence, and influence became imitation. Across Scandinavia, the scattered chieftains of old were giving way to new kingsmen who sought not only personal glory, but lasting rule. In Denmark, King Harald Bluetooth emerged as one of the first to unite his realm under both crown and cross. Around 965, he proclaimed himself Christian, erecting the great rune stone at Jelling to commemorate his deeds. The inscription still stands, declaring that Harald made the Danes Christian. It was not simply a statement of faith, but of statecraft. Christianity offered a way to consolidate power, to link his kingdom to the wider European world, and to replace the old tribal loyalties with a shared belief system. Churches rose beside ancient burial mounds, and wooden temples gave way to stone. The conversion was not always peaceful, but it was steady. Over the next generations, Denmark became the first fully Christian kingdom of the North. In Norway, the process was longer and more turbulent. The unification begun by Harald Fairhair in the late 9th century had laid the groundwork for monarchy, but regional chieftains resisted central authority. Conversion to Christianity became both a religious and political tool, used to bind the kingdom together. Kings like Olaf Tryggvason and Olaf Haraldsson, later Saint Olaf, carried the cross as both symbol and sword. Their campaigns were marked by both persuasion and violence. Temples were burned, idols destroyed, and those who refused baptism faced exile or death. Yet beneath the surface of these conflicts was a deeper transformation, the shift from a world governed by clan and honor to one ruled by law and faith. In Sweden, change came more gradually still. The great temple at Uppsala remained a center of pagan worship well into the 11th century, where sacrifices to Odin and Frey continued in the old ways. But the tide was unstoppable. By the time King Olaf Skate-Konung accepted baptism around the year 1000, the North had entered a new age. The old gods were fading, their voices replaced by the toll of church bells echoing across fjords and forests. Yet even as the Vikings embraced Christianity, they did not entirely abandon their past. The new faith merged with the old traditions in subtle ways. Runes were carved beside crosses. Christian prayers were spoken in the rhythm of Norse poetry. The concept of fate remained, though it now found expression through divine providence rather than the threads of the Norns. The afterlife was no longer Valhalla but heaven, yet the emphasis on courage, generosity, and honor endured. In this blending of worlds, the Norse achieved something rare, transformation without erasure. Their identity evolved, but their spirit remained intact. Politically, the Viking world had become a network of kingdoms connected by trade and diplomacy rather than raids. The same ships that once carried warriors now carried merchants, pilgrims, and envoys. The Danelaw in England gradually integrated into Anglo-Saxon society, its Norse-descended rulers adopting English customs and faith. In Ireland, the Hiberno-Norse towns became centers of commerce, linking Gaelic and European markets. In Normandy, the descendants of Rollo were no longer seen as outsiders, but as French nobility. Their language had changed, their gods forgotten, but their ambition endured. In 1066, that ambition reached its climax when William, Duke of Normandy, descendant of Viking settlers, crossed the Channel and conquered England. The Norman conquest marked both an end and a continuation, the final echo of the Viking spirit expressed through the architecture of empire. Economically, the end of the Viking Age coincided with the beginning of the medieval world. The networks they had built now served as arteries for trade across Europe. Silver flowed from the Islamic caliphates through the markets of Russia to the Baltic. Amber, furs, and iron moved south. Wine, silk, and glass moved north. Towns that had begun as Viking settlements, Hedeby, Birka, Dublin, York, became permanent centers of commerce. The Norse had not only discovered new lands, but had connected old ones, creating the foundation for a truly interconnected Europe. As kings rose and Christianity spread, the culture of the old sagas began to wane. The oral traditions that had once carried their history gave way to written chronicles in Latin. Yet the memory of the Viking Age was not lost. In Iceland, where independence and storytelling endured, the sagas were finally written down in the 12th and 13th centuries. Works like Njál's saga, Egil's saga, and the Heimskringla preserved the voices of an earlier time, blending history and legend into a tapestry of human experience. These writings ensured that the Vikings would not vanish into silence, but continue to speak across centuries. The decline of Viking power was not only political or religious, it was environmental. The same climate that had once enabled their expansion began to shift. Around the 12th century, Europe entered a cooler period now known as the Little Ice Age. Shorter growing seasons and harsher winters weakened agriculture across the north. The Greenland colonies, already isolated, could no longer sustain themselves. Trade dwindled, ships stopped coming, and contact with Iceland and Norway was lost. The last written record from Greenland dates to the early 15th century, a wedding at Valsey Church. After that, silence. The settlements vanished, leaving behind only ruins, testaments to both human endurance and impermanence. By then, the Viking Age was long over. The Norse had become Christian Europeans, their kingdoms part of the medieval order. The long ships that once darkened horizons had been replaced by merchant cogs and royal fleets. The sea still connected their lands, but it no longer defined them. Yet even as their world changed, the memory of the sea remained. In their art, their literature, and their consciousness, the ocean lingered as a symbol of both danger and destiny. It had been their beginning and their measure, a reminder that all things are transient, and that to live is to move between shores. The transformation of the Vikings was, at its heart, a reflection of humanity's own capacity for change. They began as scattered tribes surviving at the edges of the world. Through hardship and ingenuity, they became explorers, settlers, and kings. They adapted not by surrendering their identity, but by evolving it. They learned that strength lies not only in conquest, but in understanding. That the greatest journeys are those that lead inward as much as outward. The world they left behind was more connected, more dynamic, and more self-aware than the one they had entered. In the centuries that followed, the myths of the Vikings would take on new shapes. To their descendants, they became symbols of courage and freedom. To their enemies, symbols of fear and chaos. But to history, They were something more complex. A people who embodied the full range of human nature, curiosity and cruelty, creativity and destruction, faith and doubt. They lived close to the elements, guided by the tides and stars. And in that closeness, they revealed something timeless about what it means to be human. By the 12th century, the age of exploration had faded into memory. The sea that had once carried the Norse outward now carried pilgrims and merchants, missionaries and kings. Yet the echoes of that earlier age remained. In every port and coastal village of northern Europe, there were words, customs, and bloodlines that traced back to the time when the world had belonged to the longships. The modern nations of Scandinavia, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden were shaped by that legacy, a legacy of endurance, independence, and deep respect for the natural world. As the sun set on the Viking Age, it did so not in defeat, but in transformation. The same people who had once been outsiders became integral to the story of Europe. Their myths inspired poets. Their voyages expanded geography. Their courage reshaped history. The oars that once beat upon the sea now rested, but their rhythm lived on in language, in culture, in memory. When we think of their end, we must remember the cycle that defines all civilizations. Empires rise and fall, but the essence of their journey endures. The Norse had taught the world that boundaries are illusions, that the horizon is not a limit, but an invitation. They showed that even in the harshest conditions, humanity can build, explore, and transform. Their story is not just a tale of conquest, but a meditation on change itself, how every age must give way to the next, and how the sea, eternal and patient, bears witness to it all. In the quiet of a northern evening, when the wind moves across the water, and the sky glows with the faint light of the aurora, it is still possible to feel their presence. The longships are gone, the gods are silent, the kings are dust, but the sea remains. It remembers the sound of their oars, the crack of their sails, the songs they sang to keep fear at bay. It remembers the rise and fall of their world, the brief brilliance of a people who dared to follow the horizon. And if one listens closely, beneath the waves and the centuries, one might still hear that ancient refrain, the heartbeat of the North, the echo of those who sought not to conquer time, but to live fully within it. Night falls softly across the northern seas. The wind has quieted, the waves have grown slow, and the world feels older now. In this stillness, it is easy to imagine the faint shadow of a sail against the horizon, the ghost of a longship gliding through mist, its oars whispering against the water. It carries no raiders now, no kings or traders, only memory. The age of the Vikings has passed, but the sea that bore them remains, eternal and unchanged. The story of the Vikings is not only the story of conquest or exploration, it is the story of transformation. They began as survivors in a harsh and distant land, bound to the rhythm of seasons and the will of nature. From that struggle came endurance, and from endurance came discovery. They crossed boundaries not because they sought to rule the world, but because they refused to be confined by it. In their ships, carved from forests and shaped by wind, they carried a truth that still resonates, that the horizon is not an end, but an invitation. Standing at the ruins of their world, one can still feel the pulse of that truth. In Iceland, the black sand beaches stretch into mist, and the mountains rise like frozen waves. The ruins of old turf houses crumble into the earth, yet their outlines remain. In Norway, the fjords still mirror the sky, their waters deep and still as time itself. In Greenland, the stone walls of Halsey Church face the sea, the last witness of a vanished colony. And in England, Ireland, and France, the descendants of Norse settlers live unaware that their words, their customs, their very blood carry the echoes of the longships. The Viking Age has ended, but its essence flows quietly beneath the surface of modern life. The Norse were a mirror of humanity itself, capable of both creation and destruction, of cruelty and compassion. Their raids brought fear, but their settlements brought trade, art, and exchange. Their ships carried swords, but also stories and ideas. They were not monsters nor saints, but people driven by hunger, hope, and the desire to belong. The same instincts that sent them raiding sent them exploring, and through both, they discovered the fragility and strength of human nature. To remember them is to remember ourselves, flawed, restless, and endlessly searching. The sea was their teacher. It taught them balance, patience, and humility. It showed them that strength is not defiance of nature, but harmony with it. Every voyage was a dialogue with forces beyond their control: the wind, the tide, the weather, the unknown. They learned to trust the unseen, to navigate by instinct, to move with the world rather than against it. That wisdom is as old as time, and as relevant now as it was 1,000 years ago. For though we no longer sail by stars, we still navigate uncertainty. The ocean within us is the same, the longing for direction, the fear of the unknown, the pull toward something greater than ourselves. In the quiet of the present, it is tempting to see the Viking Age as distant and foreign, but its lessons are close, hidden in the fabric of the modern world. The cities they founded still hum with life. The languages they touched still carry their rhythm. The laws they shaped still echo in our institutions. Even the stories they told, of gods and heroes, of courage and fate, still live in our imaginations. They remind us that civilization is never a straight path, but a series of tides, expansion and contraction, forgetting and remembering. Each generation builds upon the ruins of the last, guided by the same desire to make meaning of existence. If the Vikings left behind a single message, it is that the search for belonging is endless. They sailed because the world around them was too small, and they settled because the world within them sought peace. Yet even when they built homes on distant shores, the sea never stopped calling. It is the paradox of all explorers. To move outward is to seek home, and to find home is to long once more for the horizon. Perhaps this is what made them eternal. They were never still. Even in death, their ships carried them onward to Valhalla, to heaven, to memory. To sail was to live. To stop was to vanish. The transformation of their world from pagan to Christian, from raider to ruler, was not a fall, but a return. They did not disappear, they evolved. The courage that once faced the storm now faced the uncertainty of faith. The same endurance that carried them through seas now built kingdoms and churches. In the stillness of their later centuries, when their swords were sheathed and their sails furled, they turned their strength inward, shaping nations that would endure long after their names had faded. Their legacy was not the empires they built, but the resilience they embodied. In the end, the story of the Vikings is not one of triumph or tragedy. It is a meditation on impermanence. All things rise and fall. The long ships that once ruled the seas are gone. The halls of their kings have turned to dust. The gods they worshipped are silent. Yet their spirit endures, because it was never bound to stone or sword. It lived in the act of seeking, in the courage to face the unknown. That spirit belongs to all who look out at the world and feel the pull of something greater, to all who are willing to journey, to fail, and to begin again. Imagine for a moment, standing at the edge of a fjord. The air is sharp, the sky vast. The water before you is dark, reflecting both light and depth. Somewhere beneath its surface lies the memory of oars, the whisper of wood and salt. You can almost hear them, the steady rhythm of men rowing in silence, their breath rising with the mist, their hearts beating in time with the sea. They are gone, yet they are here, forever part of the earth's rhythm. Each wave that breaks upon the shore carries their echo. Each gust of wind repeats their song. Human history is a sea of stories, and the Viking Age is one wave among countless others. It rose, it crested, it broke, and it faded, but its movement shaped everything around it. The Norse taught us that exploration is not about finding new worlds, but about expanding the boundaries of the known. They proved that courage and curiosity are the twin engines of progress. And they showed that even in the harshest environments, humanity can create beauty, meaning, and connection. Their age may be over, but the horizon they pursued will never end. The sea remains. It is the last witness, the eternal mirror. Long after the last ship was built and the last saga sung, it continues to move in its quiet, patient rhythm. The same waves that once carried longships now carry memories. The same tides that pulled them outward now return them home. The sea does not remember names. It remembers movement, persistence, and return. In that way, it remembers all of us. The Vikings lived in harmony with impermanence. They knew that every voyage begins and ends in the same place, the horizon. Their gods taught them that even the mightiest fall, that even the world itself will one day end in fire and begin anew. They accepted this not with despair, but with grace. To them, the end was not something to fear, but something to face with courage. They lived fully in the knowledge that everything passes, and that in that passing lies meaning. Perhaps this is why their story still resonates. Beneath the violence and myth lies a quiet wisdom, that to live is to face change, to embrace uncertainty, to trust in the journey even when its destination is unknown. Their ships may be gone, but their lesson endures. Every generation must become its own navigator, its own explorer, its own builder of meaning amid the shifting tides of time. And so the sea continues. It rolls and breathes, carrying the reflections of the past into the endless future. Its waves touch every shore that the Norse once touched. Its winds still whisper across the same waters they crossed. The sea holds all stories, not just theirs, but ours. It is the archive of the earth, the memory of movement, the beginning and end of every human journey. The Viking Age began with hunger and ended with faith, but through it all, the sea remained their constant companion. It taught them to endure, to adapt, to find beauty in the struggle. And even now, when we look out across that same ocean, we feel what they must have felt: the pull of the horizon, the call to explore, the quiet awe of being small in a vast and living world. For the Norse, the sea was not only their livelihood, it was their language, their scripture, their teacher. And though the centuries have changed everything else, that truth remains unchanged. The sea still speaks, and if we listen closely enough, it still tells their story of courage and change, of loss and renewal, of a people who dared to meet the unknown with open eyes and unshaken hearts. The empire of the Vikings has long vanished, but the empire of light and shadow they left behind still lives, not in conquest, but in memory. It lives in the whisper of the waves, in the gleam of sunlight on water, in the pulse of human curiosity that has never stopped asking what lies beyond. It lives wherever there are people who dream of other shores, who feel the pull of distance, who look at the horizon and see not an end, but a beginning. The sea remains vast and eternal, and somewhere, deep within its rhythm, the echo of the oars still beats, a reminder that though ages fade and empires fall, the spirit of exploration endures, as boundless and enduring as the ocean itself.